So I did my presentation on sports in South Africa, and I called my presentation Sports as a Microcosm of Society in South Africa because of all the information I found and how directly sports mirror society and the struggles faced and the values of the people of the time. So one of the main things I've found, just not even through this project, but just in life, is that sports have this magical way of connecting people. They're able to transcend time, place, and even language, as movement of the body is just like a language we can all understand. In the United States, people have the ability to follow their passions, and we often take for granted that we can just run outside and play. There's soccer fields and baseball fields everywhere where we can just go and run around, and we definitely take that for granted because in South Africa, during apartheid, the people were deprived of many basic human rights, and this actually included sports and recreation. So because of the principle of white supremacy in South Africa during apartheid, the blacks were deprived of the privilege of sports and recreation. The remnants persist today, which is visible in the three most popular sports in South Africa. The first is rugby, and rugby originated as a sport mostly played by the Afrikaners, so it was backed by the National Party, and it was their sport, and no one else could play it, so the blacks had no opportunities in rugby for a really long time. And because of this, it was one of the major sports that played a role in the sporting boycott during apartheid. The second most popular, one of the other most popular sports is soccer. And that's primarily played by blacks in South Africa. It's always been their sport because you need the least amount of materials and the least amount of training to just run around and kick a soccer ball. And then the other popular sport in South Africa is cricket. And that's actually mostly played by the Indian and British populations. But it's become one of the best integrated sports in recent years. It's really been a unifying force in South Africa. So the system of apartheid, as we know, was instituted in 1948, and the struggle against the system in the realm of sports was not prevalent until the 1960s. The first campaign to exclude South Africa on an international level of sports was from the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Summer Games. And the opposition from the International Olympic Committee was strong because they were a group kind of like the National Party. The IOC is composed of white, rich men who love watching sports but don't really understand society like it was in South Africa. So it was hard to exclude South Africa from the games. But eventually there was enough pressure, and the IOC made a kind of like a bargain with South Africa that if they said that like in the future there would be selection processes that were all-inclusive, then they could be allowed back in the games. But South Africa refused to make that promise to include all athletes, and so the first games they were excluded from were Tokyo in 1964. Controversy struck again in 1968 when they were invited back to the games in Mexico City, but there was an even stronger opposition this time, and 40 countries band together and said they wouldn't compete at the Olympics if South Africa was going to be there. So eventually the IOC banned them from those games too, and they were not reinstated into the Olympics until 1992. So like I mentioned before, rugby is one of the biggest sports in South Africa, and it played one of the biggest roles in the anti-apartheid sport boycotts. Almost every other sport was banned at the international level by 1968 or close after that, after the Mexico City Olympic Games. But rugby remained played at the international level mostly because of its origin as a white supremacist sport by the Afrikaners. But the opposition started when they went to Great Britain. The South Africa team went on a tour through Great Britain, and the citizens started bringing methods of direct action into the realm of sports. So just like they were protesting the divestment, the protests were set up inside and outside of every game to boycott the rugby and South African rugby team. And then this ideology eventually spread to most Western countries, And although rugby was never banned officially at the international level, the resistance was strong enough to kind of culturally isolate the white supremacy in South Africa and the rugby team. But ironically enough, the same sport that was the most exclusive and white became a unifying power after the end of apartheid. South Africa hosted the 1995 World Cup a year after Mandela was elected to the presidency. And South Africa was victorious in the World Cup, and the entire nation, both blacks and whites, celebrated together, showing the world that they were a united front. And this picture of Mandela shaking, this is the captain of the Springboks, which is the national rugby team. His name is Francois. It's an iconic picture showing that this World Cup really brought the nation together after such a rough time. And it definitely wasn't perfect, but it was a good start to making amends. So even more important than sports at the professional level is, I think, sports at the recreational level. Sports have proved very beneficial for children throughout time. They're an outlet and just teach many valuable lessons. And since children were deprived of all basic rights, it makes sense that they were stripped of recreation too. So since they were supposed to be kept inferior, black children were not given the same opportunities as white children. And in fact, they weren't given really any opportunities. And so one of the hardest things I found, or one of the things that was hardest to find, was like quantifiable numbers, kind of. And I finally found this table. And I don't know if, yeah, you can see it pretty well, I think. There were so many accounts of how terrible the conditions were, but there were numbers like this. And when I found this, it was just startling. So the white school, these are 3 different schools in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. And it just compares what the facilities and the equipment each school had to one another. And it's just crazy to see how much the whites had and how nothing, basically, the blacks had. And this was found in a book called The Race Game. And then it also stated a statistic that white children, there was 2,400 times more funding for recreation for white children than for black children, which is just startling. I mean, it makes sense looking at this table, but it's just a crazy number, 2,400. So progress has been made at both the professional and recreational level in post-apartheid sports. All sports have become better integrated. This is the national soccer team, and you can see that there's one white man on it, but it used to be like looked down upon for white people to play soccer because it was seen as a heathen sport because it was meant only for the blacks. But it's become a lot more integrated since then, and in 2010, the South Africa hosted the World Cup, and so it kind of showed that they're about soccer and they're unified in it now. And then for rugby too, same but opposite. So it used to be that no blacks could play because it was too good for them and too high above them. But as it's kind of pixelated on there. But there's at least 3 black men in this picture on the national rugby team. And then all South African athletes, both black and white, have found success at the Olympic Games when they were reinstated in 1992. And so sports have always been behind social change, and that's why I wanted to focus on it for my project. But even in America, people like Fritz Pollard, who was the first African American to play in the Rose Bowl and the first African American to coach in the NFL, and then Jackie Robinson, who obviously was the first African American to play in the MLB. They've broken racial barriers in America, just like racial barriers have been broken in South Africa. And it really just, like I said, it's a microcosm of society, so it really just drives social change and drives the activities of society. And then the unifying power is also prevalent in the local communities. I know most of you probably played recreational sports when you were little. It really just like forms friendships and helps community involvement. And so sports have had an amazing impact on my life, and I feel like they've truly helped me become who I am today. They led me to choosing my career into physical therapy, and studying sports in South Africa gave me a deeper and unique understanding into the society and the life they live. And so the last thing is just a quote by Mandela that kind of wraps up the point I'm trying to say about sports. And he said, "Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair." That's all.
Questions?
Any questions?
So how does this relate to your major?
My major, I'm in the physical therapy program, and I want to work with athletes, so sports are a major role in that. And I found physical therapy through sports because I was injured, and that's when I realized I wanted to be a physical therapist.
Other questions?